We are reading Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga in the chapter titled The Status of Knowledge, where he discusses the culmination of the yoga of integral knowledge into the realization of the self. And by this, he says, not merely an intellectual conception or clear discrimination of the truth. The yoga of knowledge is not knowledge in the superficial sense of the term, where we say, I know this, I understand that. It is a knowledge which is a realization which is to make real to ourselves and in ourselves the self and the divine in all its statuses. And as a result of that reality, it becomes impossible to view all things except in the light of the self. All things are seen now only as an expression of the self. It is only then that we can say that there is a realization, and we cannot fall back from that. For this realization, he says, there are three successive movements. First, internal vision. Second, complete internal experience. And then, identity. And in the portion we are now reading, he is describing these three movements. The first of which is internal vision, drishti. And we saw the sense of that in the discussion last time, where we make a distinction between two forms of knowledge, the indirect and the direct. And the direct knowledge, the most vivid experience we have when we see for ourselves. Subsequently, other senses follow. But there is nothing which is as compelling as the seeing. In the spiritual seeing, it is not the same as the physical sight. There is a different kind of experience where we still use the word seeing, but it takes place by a different organ of perception. And the nature of the perception itself is altogether different, but it can best be compared to the sense of seeing with the physical sight. And so the vocabulary used is still vision, but internal vision, drishti. There is a common question that comes up frequently. How are we to be able to see with that inner sight? And there are, in fact, in our experience, three kinds of sight, which we touched upon last time. There is the physical sight, where you open your physical eyes and you see. There is the mental sight, for which you often find it easier to close the physical sight in order to see more clearly with the mental sight. When you image something in your mind, when you visualize, see with the mind's eye. But just as the physical sight and mental sight are similar, but take place in a completely different level, different substance, and have a different qualitative character, so it is with the next step above the mental, which we may call the spiritual sight, for which also ideally the mental sight may be taught to close so that the spiritual may open. But how are we to get to that? Because the mental sight is still accessible. And if one had to describe a program for developing this capacity, then one would say that first we train the mind to become quiet and to see without effort, to allow the image to spontaneously settle in it and to turn itself to various things outside and inside. And then, when the mind is taught to become absolutely silent, it can be turned in its intention towards things more and more profound, eventually dwelling on the sense of the divine presence, immanent, transcendent, and so on. So one can initially begin with a kind of a thinking out, visualizing, conceiving, which is good and useful. And as Sri Aurobindo has described here, it helps to develop the discrimination and remove the wrong perceptions. But then eventually the mind itself has to become quiet and allow that on which it is dwelling to invade it. And it is thus that the higher perception begins to open and develop. And here Sri Aurobindo describes this process, this training program, in 3 steps. We may, by thought, inference, imagination, analogy, or any other available means, attempt to form a mental figure or conception of it, the self. Then we may hold firmly that conception in our mind and fix it by an entire and exclusive concentration. But we have not yet realized it. We have not seen God. It is only when after long and persistent concentration or by other means, the veil of the mind is rent or swept aside, only when a flood of light breaks over the awakened mentality, Jyotirmaya Brahman, and the conception gives place to a knowledge vision in which the self is as present, real, concrete, as a physical object to the physical eye that we possess in knowledge, for we have seen. So this is the 3 key words: Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. First the hearing, dwelling in reading, conception, then the thinking or mentalizing, and finally fixing in concentration. Until finally there is this rending of the veil of the mind and the experience floods in. This is the program, broadly speaking, in its most general sense. One can see how this could very easily be broken down into very specific forms and methods. So, if a program had to be popularized, made more universal to a large group of people, allowing for variations of different types and needs, then in the first stage of the Shravana, the hearing, we would spend time in satsang, in reading, in listening, and generally surrounding ourselves with things that remind us of the spirit, the clear and luminous teachings from philosophers and teachers of ancient writings. This was the first step. Then the second step would be then to dwell on it by thought, inference, imagination, analogy, or other means. This again tends to happen when we listen or we read and we hear these very common similarities of the ocean and the self, the play on the surface of the waves, but the silence in the depths. And when we dwell on that image, it's as if something deep inside us resonates and feels vividly the reality of this symbol. Or else we actually sit before the ocean or gaze at the sky or sit in front of a valley and dwell on the sense of that expanse, the vastness, the stillness, the silence, the peace, and visualize that oceanic presence and peace in the whole cosmos, the universe itself suffused with, filled with this ocean. And so as this concentration becomes more and more fixed, more and more exclusive, there comes that point where there is the tearing of the veil and the thinking or mentalizing, fixing and concentration gives way to the concrete experience, the vision, where he says, "We have seen." But this is still not enough. After this, there are frequently relapses where the experience gradually fades. It must be renewed. It must be had more and more frequently until it becomes constant. But then he says, when and how soon this becomes constant depends on the devotion and persistence with which we insist on the paths and besiege by our will or our love the hidden deity. And it is here that the exclusiveness of the quest becomes so important. The more the concentration narrows in exclusivity, the more penetrating is our entry into the experience. This is one of the reasons why isolation is preferred in almost every yogic tradition and practice, to allow for that exclusive concentration, sometimes even sustained period of concentration or isolation. Sri Aurobindo, though, does not insist on the physical isolation, but rather the exclusiveness on the focus in the midst of all things. Even as I am eating food, even as I bathe, even as I work with my hands or with my mind, the overall turn of the being remains in that exclusive orientation towards the divine. And the means for this is to begin to consecrate every activity to the divine, to visualize or begin to see, at least in the mind's eye, the divine presence in all things, and to know in the mind's thinking that all action is emerging from him, flowing in him, and returning to him through the various appearances of forms. This gives rise to a kind of a practical day-to-day yogic exercise in which, in principle, nothing comes in the way. No activity of life is an impediment. All things can be turned thus into an exclusive concentration that continues irrespective of the form of activity. In practice, though, even to get to this point, needs practice, needs some kind of a special focus and isolation. So we begin with short periods and easy activities. Begin with a simple activity which does not involve too much of mental concentration or effort, which is almost mechanical, where the mind is free to thus dwell on the concept, the idea, the visualization, imagination even of the divine presence, and to imprint that into the activity for a few minutes, because our concentration is still weak, it drifts after a while. But if we persist in that single activity and are able to extend it now beyond that activity into other simple activities, one begins the real process of developing both the power of concentration and the constancy and intimacy of the relationship with the divine, even if it is a mental experience or a mental relationship. If into that we fill in the love in the heart, the devotion for the divine, and in the action we fill in the sense of the action itself being offered to him, then the effort becomes multifaceted and more complete. With all this, we may at some point begin briefly to glimpse the immanence of the divine presence more and more vivid, more and more concrete. And still there will be periods where it is more concrete and less concrete. But the journey continues once that first contact is made. But after all this, he says, the inner vision, seeing, feeling, it's not enough. That's only the first step. The drishti perceives the divine presence. Now we know because we have experienced. But after this must come complete internal experience and then identity with the self. And how is that to be achieved? That's the discussion in the next paragraph that we now take up. The first step has brought us through the mind and heart to an experience, at first mental and then something more concrete, spiritual, but still something seen. The seeing now has to give way to an embrace. So he says, this inner vision is one form of psychological experience. But the inner experience is not confined to that seeing. Vision only opens, it does not embrace. Just as the eye, though it is alone adequate to bring the first sense of realization, has to call in the aid of experience by the touch and other organs of sense before there is an embracing knowledge, so the vision of the self ought to be completed by an experience of it in all our members. Our whole being ought to demand God, and not only our illumined eye of knowledge. So this is the transition that next begins to take place. When we see something for the first time by the eyes, observe the nature of our instinct. Suppose somebody says, do you know that I have something marvelous which can do all these wonderful things? And I say, I don't believe you. I won't believe you until I see it. I say, show me. So he shows it to me and shows the marvels that this thing is capable of. But you notice the instinct of the child is to reach out and grasp what is being shown. And until you have held it, touched it, and played with it with your own five senses, it's not yet yours. It's not yet fully possessed. I believe it is true because I have seen it, but I have not fully experienced and enjoyed it. The dog will sniff because his touch is not so developed. But through sniffing, he is entering into a more close contact. The human being feels the touch to be more concrete, more tangible. The smell and taste are secondary. If the touch of the hand is fulfilled, the smell and taste need not necessarily follow. So the sight gives way to an all-encompassing embrace through the touch. And the same thing happens also in the higher perceptions. Even it happens in the mental perception. Just as the physical sight gives way to the physical touch, the same way the mind's sight, when we visualize or conceive in the mind, also gives a more concrete experience when in the mental consciousness you are able to touch. This is a practice which is often taught in certain occult traditions, where they try to materialize an idea, not necessarily all the way to the physical, but even to give it physical force in action in the world, to concretize the idea, bring its vibration to the level of matter, and eventually even one can physically materialize, but still the principle is same. And the practice they teach is, you first visualize, let's say you visualize an apple, and then you try to, with your mind, in your mental consciousness, touch it, feel it. Or if the touch at first is too abstract, scratch it and smell. Smell the perfume of the apple. And in the eyes, vision make more vivid, fill it with the smell and the taste, and then the touch that comes through smell and taste. And so by bringing all the senses in, it becomes more and more concrete. But the same thing happens in the spiritual vision. As the rest of the senses enter, of course in a different substance, in a different way. So he says, vision only opens, it does not embrace. And the inner experience is capable of the embrace. So the vision of the self ought to be completed by an experience of it in all our members. Our whole being ought to demand God, and not only our illumined eye of knowledge. So how are the members to feel, to experience the touch of the self? We could, if it's an object, we could reach out with the fingertips and touch. But the self is not an object. It does not have a carved out distinct form, unless you speak of the self that lives in the flower, but you're still touching the flower, you're not touching the self. How do we experience the self or something which is not bound to limits of form or border? And the experience actually is similar to touch, except it is as if touch permeating, as if the fingers penetrating, filling, the self fills the limbs of our whole being with its touch, with its presence, with its peace, with its light, force, delight, ananda. Whatever the nature of the vibration it brings in the contact, the nature of the contact is actually felt permeating through the whole being. It may begin in a part, but eventually it needs to, and it eventually does fill the whole being, and we touch, feel from inside out. So the sense of the nature of the touch is also a little different, but still it is as concrete as the touch. When, for example, in deep concentration, we come in the presence, in touch with the divine presence, we feel the heart lit up with joy, with light, with peace, the mind flooded again with light, peace. Or we can even experience as if the embrace of the divine, as if an oceanic embrace, light, peace, joy, or something as if blooming out from within the heart and then spreading to fill the whole being, or as if something filling outside us, the whole universe, and we are swept into that whole revelation. And so all of these variations are possible, but in each there is the concreteness of the contact felt. So the vision of the self ought to be completed by an experience of it in all our members. That's why he says in. Our whole being ought to demand God, and not only our illumined eye of knowledge. And so everything turns in that joy of contact, the experience, but also in the aspiration, with the same intensity with which the mind or the heart will return to that. Now the question is this really possible? Because in many of the existing traditions, they say that the world is illusory, or the world is formed of ignorance, formed of relativities, unspiritual, opposite of spirit, and so on. Many variations to the philosophies. If that be the case, then how can something which is fundamentally the opposite of self or spirit ever enter in relation with it or experience it? And there's a problem there. If this be true, then separating from the body and discarding it would be the only way to enter the experience of the self. Obviously, in Sri Aurobindo's description of the cosmos, this is not accepted. He describes matter itself as substance and form of spirit, but in its most dense, in its most dull, limiting, binding form and vibration. If that be the case, then of course it is possible for matter also to experience the self and the spirit, because it is itself a special expression. However dense, however gross, however crude, however ignorant, however resistant, even opposing, it is still an expression of the principle and power of the self, and therefore there is a direct link between the self and this. And Sri Aurobindo takes pains to describe how each and every part of our being thus is an expression of a principle or power of the self. The whole human experience of the universe and this triple world of mind, life, and matter is a reflection of the upper three, Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Matter itself is a fragmented, dense representation of the principle of sheer existence. And our senses and our consciousness through the life energies is an expression of consciousness force of the Chit, of the Satchidananda. And the mind itself is an expression of fragmented, of the conceiving creative power of the Satchidananda as the Vijnan, the supramental consciousness. And permeating it all is the psychic presence, the delight, which is a reflection of the Ananda. This be the case, the highest and the lowest are intimately connected, even if that connection is covered up. And in the human being, therefore, all of the highest spiritual powers and principles are organized in their diminished, reflected, or even distorted form. But still, they are those principles here organized. And therefore, there is a deep connection. However distant, however long, however difficult to recover, it is there. And therefore, it can be said that in every part of our being, there is the possibility of experiencing the relationship with the self. And it is to this now that Sri Aurobindo points. So the question will be, how far can this embrace of the divine, of the self, take place? In which parts, to what extent? And this answer he now gives when he says, for since each principle in us is only a manifestation of the self, each can get back to its reality and have the experience of it. Our physical body itself is an expression of one principle. The life force body, Pranamaya Kosha, is itself a representation of one principle, and the mind similarly, and the inner being and the psychic being. And so if every part of us is thus tied to a special aspect, power, or principle of the self, then through each of these we should be able to deepen the relationship with the self in a different way. According to that principle by which it is connected to the self will be the nature of that relationship. And this multifaceted embrace of the self he now describes through each of the major principles and parts of our being. First with the mind, and the sequence is important because that's what is most easy for us to experience. First, we can have a mental experience of self and seize as concrete realities all those apparently abstract things that to the mind constitute existence. So for the mind, what is existence? Consciousness, force, delight, and their manifold forms and workings. And the mind can conceive of these things. That's how we have our philosophies. But through that conception, as we have seen in the last two paragraphs discussion, one can make the breakthrough to feeling the reality of these things concretely and more concretely. What is this consciousness immanent? What is this force which is playing through all things? One universal force. What is this delight which fills and underlies all things? In a sense, science comes to similar ideas through its mental quest to understand reality. And it comes to this image of the whole universe as one gigantic energy. So as we go deeper into subatomic particles, eventually all the particles resolve themselves as particular modes, rhythms, vibrations, whirling movements of a single underlying energy. And the scientist thus, dwelling on the reality, comes to a vision of the self through the mind. And it is the experience of the self through the mind's eye. This can deepen until he begins to feel concretely the reality of this energy that fills all things, and a special spiritual dimension of the experience can also begin to open up. In fact, some of the greatest scientists have had such a spiritual insight into the deeper reality, and often these things have molded their personal quest. So, consciousness, force, delight, and their manifold forms and workings, everything is here, their workings. So, one can dwell on the force in this universal energy, or the consciousness immanent in things, which expresses itself through bursts in different forms. So, in the stone, we see the consciousness lazily sleeping. When out of the powdered stone, what we call sand, the little plant emerges, it is that same sleeping consciousness which is slowly struggling and waking up and pushing out, trying to create some form of experience. And when the same plant substance is absorbed into the form and body of the animal, we see that same consciousness now more organized, more conscious, more aware, asserting itself as a separate independent unit against the larger underlying still somnambulist consciousness of the world. And then in the human, the same consciousness has woken up to its own existence, and it says, oh, I'm aware, and where did I come from? What do I really want? So you can see the whole world in terms of one permeating consciousness, expressing itself in different ways. And in each animal you find different qualities of the consciousness expressed. The power and the speed of the horse, the graceful leap of the gazelle, the lumbering, ponderous, slow movement of the elephant, the slithering, sliding movement of the snake. But all of these you will find are the same one consciousness expressing in different qualities, pushing those qualities forward and organizing forms to express them. So you have a vision of the whole universe as one massive ocean of consciousness. Or within that consciousness, we see how the consciousness acts to push, to form, to shape, to act on things, to seize, to modify. And we see the force of consciousness playing out everywhere. Even in the so-called dead matter, we see the whirling force in the atom, bound, locked up, but still tremendous power, force. That same force gradually released in a stream becomes the electricity or the lightning or the wind and ocean currents and the supernovas and so on. And everything is an expression of the play of force, one oceanic energy playing out in different forces. And then something more subtle as we meditate on this. Why is it doing all this? What is it seeking in all this? And when you meditate on nature and the play of nature, you see underlying it all, this is joy. Simply the delight to play, to manifest, to experience, to enjoy. And it's as if there is a delight permeating all this consciousness and force and the play, which is now particularizing itself in each form, through each experience. And even it delights in a contrary experience of defeat, of being pushed back, of breaking, of being unable to face the intensity of the pressure which we experience as pain or suffering. But there is still behind that a delight of a novelty of experience. So in the mind one can dwell on these things until they become a vivid living reality through the mind's meditation, through the mentalizing and fixing of the concentration, a glimpse, a perception which deepens. Thus, the mind is satisfied of God. And this is through the mental experience reaching out towards self. We can have an emotional experience of the self through love and through emotional delight. Love and delight of the self in us, of the self in the universal, and of the self in all with whom we have relations. And so here the journey begins not with the mind dwelling on things, but the heart dwelling on things. But how does the heart dwell? It still uses the mind as the first point of focus, point of connection. But then in that perception, in that image, there is a relationship that fills. And the relationship of the emotions takes uh, precedence over the mental perception itself. Mental perception is only like a backdrop, a base on which now the heart fills with its feelings. So the emotional experience of the self is always a character of love, capital L. But that love has many facets: emotional delight, love, and so on. First experienced with the self in us, then with the self in the universe, and then with the self in all particular things. And this is the normal sequence. It is difficult to have a true experience of the self in an individual at first. It is less difficult to have the experience of the self in the universe in general without particularizing to an individual. But it is easiest to have the experience of the self within us and to experience identity within us. To experience identity with something other than us is harder because it means we have to break free from the limitations of our own ego sense. But it is easier to go within as if bypassing the ego crust, go deep inside and experience the touch of the self within and lose ourselves in that identity or in that relationship of love to the self. So it is often easier to begin with visualizing, conceiving, or feeling the divine presence deep inside the heart. And we say deep because it has to be behind the emotions, although the emotions may play in the relationship at first. The self, the divine presence itself, transcends the emotions. And so to conceive it as something very deep helps to limit what would otherwise be simply an emotional self-love and which would be an easy error. But as one goes deeper in this, there is a deepening of the contact, a kind of a purification of our emotions, a sweetness, a tenderness, a self-giving and a love which we feel from deep inside, but to which we respond in kind by giving ourselves in that love, in that sweetness, in that tenderness, to that. It is in the context of the integral yoga, it is easiest to conceive the image of the Divine Mother or of the Lord in whatever aspect or form you find most easy. For those who have naturally an affinity with the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, it is easy even to visualize their image. There are people who go through an elaborate kind of visualization experience. For example, some people go through a whole exercise of visualizing themselves going up the steps to the mother's room, entering her room, seeing her seated on the chair, going up to her, bowing down to her, receiving her blessing, and coming back. But if you notice, it is not the particular visual which is important. If the form of the room was changed, you put her on a chair sitting in the middle of a forest, it would still be as vivid, a beautiful experience. Perhaps not as familiar for my visualization, that's all. So if you look at the nature of the experience and gradually strip away these specifics of it, you will find the essence of it is the perception that she is there already waiting. I am going towards her and I grow closer to her. And as I grow closer to her, all the senses begin to fill in visually, and then the touch, the perfume, the sounds, and then the contact and the penetration of the contact. And all of this is the essence of the experience. You can place her outside you, you can place her within you. You can climb up the steps or you can pass through a tunnel. The form of it is irrelevant. It is the sense that she is there waiting, and the love of the heart which pours towards her. She is waiting for you and she responds equally with the same love. And then the growing closer in intimacy and in contact and the filling in through all the senses until there is some kind of a merging or self-loss of separateness with the heart, with the love, with the delight of that relationship. So we can have an emotional experience of the self through love and through emotional delight. Love and delight of the self in us. So the first step, it is this which becomes the way in which the heart relates. But this is not complete until we begin to see that she is not just inside me, but she is everywhere in all beings. But now to particularize it to specific forms and individuals is more difficult. I may see her seated as in the whole universe, as the Divine Mother, pouring her love on all things, filling all things, playing in all things, supporting all things, sustaining them with her consciousness and her force and her love and her delight. And so a general sense of the presence in the universe now becomes easy. If we have had first that relationship within, and it has become vivid and concrete, it is very easy. It even happens spontaneously that we then begin to feel it everywhere. I walk through life with that relationship, with the joy and delight of that intimacy of her presence, and I look at everything, and the joy of my relationship with her fills everywhere. And so it is almost automatic that we begin to feel it everywhere. And then automatically we begin to feel her working through circumstances, through situations, in a general way, and then more specifically through people in different ways. And so the second stage of the relationship naturally unfolds of the self in the universal. And then eventually it particularizes and the self in all with whom we have relations. The wording is very suggestive. Those with whom we don't have relations, of course, we don't even turn to look. But if we did, that's a relationship already, and we perceive the same presence. But it is more intimate, more specific with those whom we know. Thus, the heart is satisfied of God. The third, and this is different, it is a part of the aesthetic mind and the senses through which this will take place. We can have an aesthetic experience of the self in beauty, a delight perception and a taste of the absolute reality, all beautiful in everything, whether created by ourselves or nature, in its appeal to the aesthetic mind and the senses. So the mind perceiving, relating, the heart relating in delight, both fall short of a sensory experience. Do I hear? Do I taste, smell, touch? And at least in the senses, it takes a very specific form. In the mind and the heart, the form is not so important. When I feel myself close to the beloved, my eyes may be closed, it doesn't matter. The closeness of the emotion is the true closeness. But with the appreciation of the senses, it is the sight and the aesthetic appearance of the form which takes priority. And even into this, the relationship with the self and with the divine can come. And it is this which then allows the full appreciation of the divine in the details of life experience. Till then, there is a kind of an abstraction, separation from form. Here it takes on particularity of form. And what is the nature of that aesthetic experience of the self? In beauty. And the nature of that interchange, delight, perception, and taste of the absolute reality, all beautiful in everything. Now, again, this can have several layers. First, when you look at a form which is beautiful, let's say a flower, and in the flower, you gaze, feel the divine presence and the beauty of the flower, its form, and its expression, and its unfolding, its gentle movements in the breeze. the perfume that spreads, which reaches you, fills you, surrounds. And in all of these, we appreciate the delight of the form and beauty. Taste. Sri Aurobindo uses the taste, the word taste here. The translation into English of the yogic term rasa, the sap of delight, juice, loosely translated, but it has a very specific sense. It is something deep, refined, filling, which makes the juice tasty, which brings into the juice the experience of delight, which makes the thing what it is. And it is the enjoyment of that which is highlighted in the whole field of aesthetics. So there is a rasa, a taking in of the delight in everything. It is not the form, it is not the action, it is not the interaction, but the thing which fills it that makes it worthwhile, that is the rasa. So when I look at the flower, if I crush it and extract the juice, that's not the rasa. When the flower has wilted and I'm unable to appreciate it, I'm still losing the rasa. But when it is fresh and glowing, the glow which makes it beautiful, which makes it special, which makes it heavenly almost, that is the thing in which the rasa is felt. Later, one may begin to enjoy variations of rasa even as the flower fades, even as it changes form, and even the things which are not so beautiful to our conventional aesthetic sense, we may still enjoy the rasa. So when the tiger leaps to catch the deer and eats it, on the one hand, we feel the sadness of the deer which is being killed and eaten. On the other hand, we have to accept that this is the only way the grace of and the strength of the tiger can be experienced. And this is the relationship. The tiger does not kill out of hate or for a perverse sport. It kills because it has to eat. It is hungry. It kills only as much as it needs. It shares beyond what it has. And the movement of the tiger leaping to catch the deer, the struggle of the deer, all of these have a certain grace and aesthetic character also. And at first one may see it as part of a larger universal movement, a cycle, a play of things moving, sustaining across millions of years. And we see the deer never really dies, it is only changing form. And things are moving on, changing form in cycles. And there's a great aesthetic beauty to this whole unfolding of nature. So there's a sense of beauty, a delight, perception and taste of the absolute reality, all beautiful in everything. Later, from the in everything, we see it glowing out in and through the form also of things. But first it is in everything. We look at a piece of art, a painting, a sculpture, or a musical performance, and it fills us with a kind of a joy. The very fact of seeing it fills us with joy, and there is the rasa grahana, the tasting of that delight, perception, through the beauty of it. And this is a problem with describing this. How do you define the sense of delight which you take in, the sense of beauty which fills you, which captivates you? There is in Sanskrit a very beautiful description, definition of beauty, and it goes thus: that which reveals newness from moment to moment. That is the essence of beauty. And so you look at something beautiful, you're attracted because it is something new. You've never seen it before. And then after a while, normally you would expect to lose interest. Now I've seen it. But when it's beautiful, you can't turn your eyes away because it's as if it's glowing out something new every moment. And so you keep on looking at it. And notice when you gaze at it, there is as if something within you that drinks, that takes the essence of that nourishes itself. And the delight that fills your heart is coming from that taking in of the beauty. It's literally like a drinking or a tasting or a drawing in. There's a phrase from Shakespeare, I believe, where he says, "Drink me with thine eyes." The lover says to the beloved, "Drink me with thine eyes, and I will with mine." And you see here this idea of as if taking in something in the gazing of something beautiful. This is the term in the yogic tradition we say rasagrahana, taking in the delight. And it can happen through all the senses. You listen to the music, and again it's as if you're taking in something. If the musician is an extraordinary master, then he's actually giving something. But what he gives is not his, he receives, and it flows through him, through his music. And he himself enjoys the nourishment as much as we do. It fills him as much as it fills us. So he becomes at that moment a vehicle to transmit, to materialize, to bring into form, to give birth to experiences of higher spiritual domains. And this is the true nature of art and aesthetics. There is a phrase often used in modern artistic exploration. They say, you must have art for the sake of art. And you'll notice what that leads to. It leads to art which is often quite weird. And you do not feel anything elevating. Of course, that also has its own rasa, perhaps. But the true sense of art is art for the sake of the spirit. Art to manifest the divine. Art to manifest beauty with a capital B. Delight of the divine existence. And it is to this that the aesthetic experience of the self takes us. So he says, we can have an aesthetic experience of the self in beauty, a delight, perception, and taste of the absolute reality, all beautiful in everything, whether created by ourselves or nature, in its appeal to the aesthetic mind and the senses. So the part which is enjoying this is something of the mind, emotion, and senses, which we associate with the aesthetic consciousness. Thus, the sense is satisfied of God. So we have had three now. The mind satisfaction of God, the heart satisfaction of the God, and now the senses are satisfied of God. And there is one more. We can have even the vital nervous experience and practically the physical sense of the self in all life and formation, and in all workings of powers, forces, energies that operate through us or others or in the world. It does not describe too much what this is like because it's actually not so obvious even in our own physical experience of the world. Most of our experience of things is through the mind, through the heart, or the aesthetic sense. We rarely ever experience directly with the body. Even when the body experiences some form of enjoyment, let's say of taste or of the senses, what experiences is still the aesthetic sense using the body as a vehicle. It is not the body itself enjoying or the body itself knowing something. This is a different grade of experience upon which the mother worked extensively. She worked on the body consciousness to awaken it to the relationship with the self. And there is, of course, a general body consciousness, and then there is a general function of the body in some part or some limb, and that consciousness can be awakened, and then some organ and its functioning can be similarly awakened. And for all of these basic exercises such as asanas, or some general physical exercise done in the spirit of concentration, consecration, prayer, felt in the body, all of these can be helpful. But the mother went much deeper, all the way down to the individualized cellular consciousness. Even to become aware of a single cell in us is impossible, as we are currently. She not only went deep into the body consciousness, identifying the cell as a separate unit of consciousness, but then went into that consciousness and from within it turned its aspiration towards the divine and brought into it that awakening. So that's an extraordinary thing. Sri Aurobindo here only points in that direction, does not go into specifics of it. Only in the last two chapters, briefly, he touches upon the possibility of the self, of the physical cells participating, which he then elaborates much more only in the last few articles of the supramental manifestation on earth, the series that we studied already. He kept it for later because mostly it was inaccessible to the world. But there is something else happening today, which I want to only use as an indicator. It is not yet the thing, but it is a small beginning. There is increasingly among people all over the world the recognition that we need to feel and experience in the body. And this is something which some people experience more and most people experience very little. I've seen, generally speaking, though women are able to feel this much more intensely, the need to experience something or the completion of an experience only when it enters into the body consciousness. And you experience it as really the substance of your body itself. But even this is some way away for the self to be felt in this way. At first, it is the vital nervous experience, and only from the vital nervous experience it percolates down to the physical feeling something. So he says, we can have even the vital nervous experience and practically the physical sense of the self. So it is a life force in the body which first responds. We feel this most concretely when there is a descent of the power of the self or the peace of the self, and the whole body becomes as if densified, filled with the denseness of the peace and the presence of the self, and the body feels itself a part of it. So the sense of the self in all life and formation and in all workings of powers, forces, energies that operate through us or others in the world. So there's a whole sequence beginning with what we feel within us, extending to other things. And there can come a point of experience where the body feels itself as substance or vehicle for the self. And when it touches another object, it experiences that other object also as vehicle, substance of self. In fact, when this tends to form in the body at first, the body feels itself in continuity with the whole universe. Just as mind can experience a universality and feel itself wide, boundless, limitless, even infinite, transcending all forms and limits. Similarly, the heart can experience itself liberated and freed and pouring love to all things, receiving love from all things in the universalization of the heart. Even the senses could begin in this way. But when the body begins to experience the self, it has often this first universalizing character. All matter is one continuous substance of divine matter, of which I, body sense, is one portion, not separate at all, but in the continuity. So when I touch the table, I feel as if my hand touches my own hand. See, there's a difference subjectively to us when I touch another object or a person or my own hand. When I touch my hand, there's a familiarity. I am with me. There's a security, a sense of identity underlying the separateness. But something like that comes into the physical experience of things. You touch an object, it is my hand, it's on my body. I've placed my hand on my own lap as I place it on the table. I pick up the book, I've lifted my own limb. I do not feel the sense of separateness. It is as if the body consciousness permeating the body substance here permeates all things even. This is often one of the forms in which the body begins to feel the sense of self. So he says we can have vital nervous experience and practically the physical sense of the self, and it extends in all life and formations, and then it extends in all workings of powers, forces, and energies. Even when something comes and strikes me, it is only my hand which bumped into my hand. And how painful is that? You notice even this physical experience is different. If somebody hits me, it hurts harder than if I hit myself. Why? The body responds differently. The impact will be exactly the same, but I don't feel pain. I feel a dull throb, and that's it. The tingling briefly. I don't feel pain. But if someone else does it, the same strike creates pain. So I have this sense of things coming upon me, and all forces are part of my own extended physical consciousness. And there is in all things the self filling. Powers, forces, energies that operate through us or others or in the world. In one of the poems, Sraddhalu describes the whole universe in cosmic consciousness. But when it reaches this material level, he says, Arcturus and Belphegor are in me. The biggest stars, biggest systems in the universe are inside me. Thus, the life and the body are satisfied of God. So this completes the four broad principles through which the self has organized itself in this thing we call the human being. And all four are special facets of the self expressing in material life. So just to go back, our whole being ought to demand God, and not only our illumined eye of knowledge. And now you can see how the whole being can be in that demand of God. We read the whole thing again and you get the full sense of it in a single sweep. We can have a mental experience of self and seize as concrete realities all those apparently abstract things that to the mind constitute existence, consciousness, force, delight, and their manifold forms and workings. Thus the mind is satisfied of God. We can have an emotional experience of the self through love and through emotional delight, love and delight of the self in us, of the self in the universe, and of the self in all with whom we have relations. Thus the heart is satisfied of God. We can have an aesthetic experience of the self in beauty, a delight perception and taste of the absolute reality, all beautiful in everything, whether created by ourselves or nature, in its appeal to the aesthetic mind and senses. Thus the sense is satisfied of God. We can have even the vital nervous experience and practically the physical sense of the self in all life and formation and in all workings of powers, forces, energies that operate through us or others or in the world. Thus, the life and the body are satisfied of God. But still there is one more step needed. Remember the three steps. First, internal vision. Second, complete internal experience. And then identity. So when we have all the facets of our being in this experience, there's a complete internal experience, perhaps even more progressively increasing, but the identity remains. And that now he describes. All this knowledge and experience are primary means of arriving at and of possessing identity. So through all this we are approaching the identity. It is our self that we see and experience, and therefore vision and experience are incomplete unless they culminate in identity. Unless we are able to live in all our being the supreme Vedantic knowledge, He am I, so hum. We must not only see God and embrace Him, but become that reality. We must become one with the self in its transcendence of all form and manifestation, by the resolution, the sublimation, the escape from itself of ego, and all its belongings into that from which they proceed, as well as become the self in all its manifested existences and becomings. So both levels. And then third, one with it in the infinite existence, consciousness, peace, delight, by which it reveals itself in us, and one with it in the action, formation, play of self-conception, with which it guards itself in the world. So three levels. We must know the self in its transcendence, in its becomings, and then in its play through the formations. So the fine distinctions between the second and third we will explore next time. But the point he's getting to here is, so far through vision we entered into experience, and perhaps even a completed experience in all the facets, parts of our being. But that's not complete until it merges into identity in all the parts of the being. So again, the identity may begin in some part of the mind, some part of the heart. Sometimes in the aesthetic experience, briefly, there is a sense of identity. I become the beauty of the flower. I share in the beauty of the flower. I enjoy the delight of the bee as it tastes the nectar of the flower. And all of these are possible in portions, but eventually that identity also has to extend to all these until we can say in totality, He am I. We must not only see God and embrace Him, but become that reality. So the three steps: seeing, embracing, and then becoming one in identity. And you notice how these three steps are innate to all human quest. I will take up very mundane examples, but I point to them precisely because this triple step in the spiritual identity is not something alien to us. It is our deepest instinct. I spoke earlier of that example. A child wants to reach out and hold. I show some new device, some new toy. After seeing, he wants to hold and experience with all his senses. But then at some point you will see he takes it close to himself. And now he seeks to wield it according to his will, as if identifying with the toy, that the toy becomes an instrument of his own consciousness, not separate from him. The same thing we experience when we see something beautiful. Maybe it's in the window of a shop. I want to reach out, possess, and make it mine. But the making mine is where the problem is, because it always remains a separate piece. I can never merge it in myself, except by a kind of a sense of possession. It's mine now and it's part of me, and if somebody touches it, I give a dirty look. How dare he touch? That's my possession. It's like he's touching my body. This is the most precious object. And I push him away. Stay away. Don't touch it unless I give you permission. But the same thing exists also in our relationship with people, especially in the experience of human love, where there is an attempt not only drink with your eyes, but to embrace, and then as if to merge, an attempt to identify, to lose ourselves in the other, or to experience the other as ourselves. And Sri Aurobindo observes that very often the love takes the form in the animal world of eating, because that's the way in which one can merge the other into oneself, absorbing the other, assimilating, to make the body your own. And there is a movement of eating the loved. Suffocating even to extinguish is a distorted form of it. But you see the same instinct to absorb until there is no more separateness left. The mother describes how she observed in the zoo the snake eating the rabbit, and at first the rabbit was afraid, but after a while it felt drawn towards the snake and gave itself and allowed itself to be eaten. There is in fact in the snake itself an immense love in this movement of absorption. And so our idea of what takes place is not always accurate when in the animal world there is this kind of absorption and taking in. But you see how everywhere there is this three-step process. First the seeing, the embracement, and then the immersion and identity. But in material terms, identity means extinction. One has to be extinguished in order to be merged into the other in the domain of form. But in consciousness, this is possible. Only in self, identity is possible without extinction. Because self, transcending form, yet expresses through form, is form. But because in its essence it transcends form, it can inhabit all form. It is the same one self in all forms, in me as in the other. And therefore the identity is possible in self, and the fulfillment of all the seeking of human love or human relationships or of the sense of possession, ownership, control or mastery of things in the world, all of these can be fulfilled only when we recover the identity in self and the mastery that comes through that identity. So we must not only see God and embrace Him, but become that reality. So the methods so far discussed, all this knowledge and experience are primary means of arriving at and of possessing identity. And if we do not aim at that, everything is left half done. Because the logic here is very simple, the self we see is ourself, and we are not complete until we have recovered oneness with ourselves. Unless we are able to live in all our being the supreme Vedantic knowledge, He and I. So, and then there are three facets to that oneness with the self, transcending, immanent, and then specific to each form. And all three have to be realized. And we see how all three are necessary for the completeness of the experience. It is the transcendence which gives you the freedom, and from the freedom the mastery. It is the immanence which gives you the universality of the experience and the limitlessness of the satisfaction. And then it is the individuality of the self form and expression which gives the intimacy and the special personal character that finally completes and fulfills all this. And so all three we will look at next Friday. For now we can pause here. After this he gives an example in the next paragraph of how the modern mind finds it difficult to conceive intellectually of self or of God, and how we may train the mind to begin to see this through nature. And he refers to the poetry of Wordsworth. But in all this you see how the mind's approach and understanding is used as an entry point eventually to lead to a concrete experience, embracement and identity. So when people say very loosely and wrongly that, oh, it is a mental experience, oh, it is all mind's imagination, and mind is the problem, get rid of the mind, it comes from a wrong understanding of things, or it comes from a tradition which considers that its way to realize the absolute. But it is not the only way. And in the integral yoga, all the means, all the instruments of our nature are to be turned simultaneously towards that one fulfillment. So we can pause here and we can take up any questions or anything you would like to share. Yes, in fact, this is one of the early first steps, starting points, which Aurobindo describes earlier in this text. Our consciousness is turned outwards. We are as if hypnotized by the play of the appearance of the energy of nature. And there is a necessity to turn the attention inwards, to become aware of who is observing, who is enjoying. It gives us a first status of freedom. But the person we have so found to be is not yet the true person. And this is the text we are studying in the Kena Upanishad. Who in the seer is seeing? I am aware that I am observing and enjoying, but who is seeing in my sight? Who is enjoying in my experience of enjoyment? And we recognize there is a true seer behind, a true enjoyer behind. And so this inward gaze now goes deeper to seek the source of it. Ramana Maharshi similarly advises that ask yourself who's asking the question. And so the attention is turned inward to the source of the need to question, the need to know. And so we go to something still deeper. And of course, there's a point where you have to, the vehicle itself has to be let go on. Otherwise, the questioning binds you to itself. So you ask the question and then you dwell on it, and there is a deepening of the consciousness and the questing, which becomes wordless, thoughtless, eventually in some deeper awareness. And perhaps we go through layers across a long period of time. When we first experience this through the methods and the various facets that we have already discussed, a first glimpse of self, there is a long period of deepening in that perception, in that contact, in the embracement and identity. And it takes time, sometimes years, before that can be fully established in its deepest or highest. And we wonder why. And a lot of it was simply because, well, there's so much which preoccupies us in life. But a lot of it is also because it is so deep, so far within, that it takes time to go inside. When you sit for meditation, and even if you've quieted yourself and gone within, you will notice it takes time to go deeper. Some days more time, some days less time, but it takes time. And so if you had to go all the way to the depth, it takes more time. The mother gives a very interesting description of sleep. She says a part of our consciousness detaches and goes deeper and deeper and deeper until for a few seconds it enters in contact with the Satchidananda. And then the rest of the sleep is the return journey. It's 2 or 3 seconds of that contact which rejuvenates the whole consciousness and you come up fresh. If those 2 or 3 seconds are somehow prevented, even if you have slept 7 or 8 hours, you're not fresh. So you see, the point here is there's a time period needed to go in and come out in a normal process, and that's where the sleep takes time. If you did it by a yogic process, as the mother did, she said she would recover, rejuvenate herself in this way in 15 minutes. For about 10 years, until 1930s, she didn't have a bed. She would sit on her couch, which you will see tomorrow when you come down from the mother's room. Just as you come down the stairs on the first floor, you turn, there's a sharp U-turn you have to make. You'll see mother's couch there where she used to sit. And next to it, Aurobindo's chair from where he used to write the letters. So she would sit there, go deep into trance, go all the way to the Satchidananda and return. But the whole thing was 15 minutes still, with all the acceleration from her tremendous power of concentration. So the point is, yes, it takes time. And so for us it takes longer or lesser, but it takes time, so we allow that time. And then, and the gradations, degrees through which we grow in this way. So if we take this as the theme for tomorrow, we can look at that example I mentioned earlier, where some people find it useful to visualize going to meet the mother in their meditation. But if we take this as the theme, with all the parts of our being, the mind, the heart, the aesthetic senses, and the body, nerves, we approach the mother when we go up to her room. So there cannot be anything more beautiful and powerful and complete if we do it in that way. This was the whole point the mother made of the physical contact. You can feel the divine presence everywhere, but when you had the opportunity to meet the mother physically and to receive blessings physically, it had the possibility of all these parts simultaneously participating in the relationship. So we can take it in that spirit as we prepare ourselves to go to the mother, to meet her through all these parts, and the journey itself as we climb up the steps, and let all parts of our being similarly grow in intensity of aspiration as we climb up. And then, in that moment, to embrace as completely as possible through all these parts, to lose ourselves in union, however briefly, however partially, in whatever portion of the heart or mind or senses, and then to retain when we return, to carry as in a container what we have received, to protect, to nurture and nourish it. Mother complained that many times she would give people what they needed when they came, but by the time they went down the stairs, they would be back to their old state. And so it is necessary to consciously retain, avoid dissipation, dispersion, nurture, make to grow and intensify what is received, and if possible, to absorb and hold within us in our deepest and purest or highest part, that it remains as a bundle, a power, a gift of the spiritual energy kept in its most secure space. Otherwise, if we don't consciously do that, it tends to dissipate. You go through one sleep, one afternoon nap, and it's gone somewhere. We don't know where, absorbed in the subconscious. So we can consciously learn to store it in some part where we will have access to it again and again. And it remains as a power and intensity which is a constant help in our spiritual journey, the tapo bala, the strength of the tapas, concentration. So we can close for today and continue this next Friday.